He's like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man, the dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
All right, Athenian stranger, welcome back to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me on again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you back on. I think our conversations are always productive. But this is one that I've been wanting to have for a while because in the discussion of Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction, which has sort of hit the headlines, as it were, the sort of center-right are freaking out about Schmittians, this obscure Nazi legal scholar, as he's been called. But buried in that is a concept of friendship, which you and I have discussed at length, but also a concept of the enemy. So when we say that term, the enemy, what does Schmitt mean by it?
Yeah. So, one thing that needs to be kept in mind here is that he often uses. See, this is what's so important about Schmitt, and what makes him either someone that people immediately appreciate and sort of say, this is it, or they immediately say, these people are not thoughtful or something or whatever, is when you say the friend enemy, the thing is that presumes you know what the friend is, right? That also presumes you know what the enemy is. And Schmitt's term for the enemy often uses the Latin, which is inimicos, which doesn't have the strict meaning of just an enemy. It could be something that, and he's clear about this in the concept of the political when he talks about, look, just because two nations work together and they're friends doesn't mean they're friends forever. Same thing with regard to the notion of the enemy or the inimicos or something like that. And so, that's why I think that people's reactions to Schmitt, their sort of firsthand reactions, tell me a lot about them, right? Are they immediately looking for friends? Are they immediately looking for enemies? And how they react to, in other words, how they react to you bringing up Schmitt and talking about the friend enemy? Do they immediately critique you as like, oh, because then you're like, well, okay, you just already failed the friend enemy distinction on your parts. You're not going to give me any, because it's usually very unthoughtful criticisms of people, because it's fashionably popular for people to say, oh, do you denounce? Schmitt was associated with the Nazis. Do you denounce? The same thing with Heidegger or something. It's like, look, if that's the level of depth that we're going to be using as our criteria, then why even bother engaging with these people at all? Because they're acting like children, just wanting to dismiss.
Certainly. And I think one of the other difficult things about this is that oftentimes people read into Schmitt a sort of moral dimension he doesn't seem to be speaking in. Exactly. They say that Schmitt is writing this as, oh my gosh, isn't this great? We should all do this. This is the best thing ever, this friend-enemy distinction. Whereas if you read Schmitt, he's much drier than that. He is looking at how humans act and drawing conclusions from that. It goes back to that famous kind of centerpiece in the School of Athens, right? Where you have Aristotle pointing down at the ground saying, like, what is, what we are talking about, what we see, and you're building out, philosophy from that. And I think that is a common fundamental misunderstanding with Schmitt. I don't pretend to be a Schmitt scholar. I've read the concept of the political, other works, and certainly a lot of scholarship on Schmitt as well. But to me, much like Machiavelli, who is very much in the same tradition, or hell, Hobbes even, people look at that as a desirable end goal. Hobbes is, I guess, slightly different, but a discussion for another day. And it's difficult, again, because it's hard to say how much is that misreading honest, a mistake, a simple misunderstanding, or philosophy through memes, right? Having no real context with the original source, and how much of it is a willful and deliberate misunderstanding. Oh, you quoted from Nazi man, therefore you are Nazi, therefore you can be disregarded. But let's dig back into that concept of the enemy, concept of enmity. So that phrase in Latin, inimicus, right? How would you contrast that with another kind of Caesar, Gallic Wars concept of the hostes? Is there something different there? Is that term used specifically for a reason?
Well, I mean, what he's trying to do, what he's saying about the friend enemy is that this undergirds the notion of the state because it is the most fundament, as he would say, or the foundational element of what constitutes the political. And I mean, just to your point about the moral thing, I mean, Schmitt in the concept of the political says, look, we're distinguishing from morality, right? We're talking about the political because the morality takes place within the political. And so the political is more fundamental is what he's essentially trying to say. I mean, and he brings up Machiavelli and those other thinkers. And so the thing is that you can't have, this is why he's going to say that the enemy essentially is more important. And this is what I try to get people to understand. For the friend-enemy distinction with Schmitt, the inimicos, or the enemy, is more important because the urgency is what he says is that to presume that all men could get along, that you would have society of all friends, he goes, that's never happened. He says that's the history of man, that's never happened. He goes, but thinking in terms of the enemy at the extremes, he's talking about the extremes. In terms of the enemy, it just means that you have a state of war. And he goes, and that does happen. That happens all the time. And
I mean,
so
that is the Hobbesian state.
Right, exactly. That's what I was going to say. That's why he's going to say that no one has done this better than Thomas Hobbes, because what we have with Schmitt, and see now this is going to distinguish also the friend from the enemy. What you have with Hobbes is he is radically critiquing, and not even really critiquing, he's mocking to just make him seem uncredible completely without giving any arguments. Aristotle. And Aristotle, of course, is the one who says, has so much to say about friends. And he's also the one who says that man is by nature the political animal. And he uses the word logos, right? Man is by nature the creature with reason. And he also says man is by nature political. And that's when he has this 2 entire chapters of the Nicomachean Ethics devoted to friendship, because he's going to say that the laws, the nomos, and that's going to be a crucial word for Schmitt, the law or nomos of the political body is what makes the different kinds of friendships possible. So Aristotle doesn't have much at all to say about enemies. He privileges friendship because it's friendship that we're going to get in a very rich psychology of how to understand what it means to be by nature political and rational. With Hobbes, the man is by nature. I mean, this is the transition from pre-modern natural law to modern natural law. In other words, the law of nature. Right? What is the law? The law of nature in Hobbes is going to be that the natural state of man is bloody. I mean, I could read you the passage. It's just amazing. He goes, it's brutish, one of just utter suffering. Now, what does that tell you? In other words, by nature, if men in political community are going to resort to this state of war, which is gruesome and bloody, then man is by nature not friendly towards other men. In fact, man is by nature, they have enmity, great enmity in many ways, towards other men. And so what Hobbes does is he lowers the bar radically from where it was with the pre-moderns, which is to say, follow nature. Nature is our source. It's our guide. And what is natural to man is reason. Man is by nature reasonable. Man is by nature political. Hobbes inverts that and says, no, man is by nature fundamentally barbaric. And so what is needed is to get man out of nature. In other words, out of the state of nature. And how do you do that? Well, with Hobbes, you do that by having an enlightened despot. This is going to be the whole role of the symbolism of the Leviathan for Hobbes. And that's going to mean everything for Schmitt, because he's going to have an enormous amount to say about the use of political symbols and their failure, most especially. But what's crucial is that Schmitt is following the lead of Hobbes regarding this radical turning away from the pre-moderns, and in particular, of course, Aristotle, in order to properly understand the nature of man, so that man can have political community. And so again, what's most definitive of man by nature is that they're not friendly towards each other, right? They're enemies. I mean, they will plunder and murder and pillage their neighbors, right? And so for Schmitt, the enemy comes out as the most important, and because that is what is most urgent. War or fights between men can break out at any point, right? A disagreement in a conversation, if it's a significant conversation. And so the imagery that Schmitt uses is men who are willing to be brothers in arms in war versus those who are going to shrink back from the front lines, right? So in many respects, you could say that the friend-enemy distinction in Schmitt is determined by that symbolism that he uses. The friends are the people who join you at the front lines of the war, right? The enemies, your enemies, are the ones who slink back. And so to know who your enemies is more important, because then you really know who's fighting with you in the front lines, right? I mean, so you have to know who are the guys slinking back. In other words, for whatever reason, either cowardly or because they've just been deceptive and misled you into saying, yeah, I'll join you. Yeah, we'll go take care of that group of people. And then they send you off, and then you're at the front line, and you're like, all right, let's get him. And you're like the one man standing alone. It's like they've drifted off behind you. So that's going to be how one determines the enemy, is who is engaged in the fight with you, right? If you are in a war, if you're in a fight with others, who are the people that are there with you? Because for Schmitt, remember, what Schmitt is going to say, what he's defending the political from is the deneutralization or the neutralization, right, of all these various, the depoliticization or the neutralization, in other words, of all these various realms that used to be, really they're going to be what's referred to as culture, these cultures of this, aesthetics, right, all these kinds of things. But that's what is so crucial, is he's defending that against the fact that things have become new. So in other words, you don't want neutrality. People who are going to say, well, I'm neutral in this, right? I'm neutral. Schmitt would say, in other words, you're not political. In other words, you're not a friend, you are an enemy, right? Because you are ensuring the neutralization of these various zones that constitute, superveniently, we could say, that which is the political. And well, anyway, I've kind of riffed there for a minute. So if there's anything you want to add or questions, or anything.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting thing, because you'll oftentimes, and I can't remember if it might have been Audre Lorde. It was another, regardless if it wasn't her, it was someone kind of similarly ghastly, who came up with that, that aphorism, the personal is political. The idea that every facet of who you are is political. And as is often the case, the woke is more correct than the mainstream. There's something true, there's something accurate there. Maybe not in the way she meant it, right? As some sort of like rotund.
They're always, whenever they're correct, it's by accident. So
Yes.
what they mean is like misses the mark, and you're like, well, if this is what she meant, she would have been right, but it's not. It ends up being not what she meant at all. It's like, okay, well, you're wrong, right?
Yes,
You're,
exactly.
yeah.
The snappy line is there's something there. Again, not in the way she made it. But when you look at sort of more unified societies, from a certain perspective, you could say, well, that is a less political society because there is broad agreement on certain issues. For instance, look at the American founders. Regardless of their very real disagreements, no one among those men would have looked at, shall we say, like the excesses of the LGBT movement and said, I support that. That would have been seen as completely and entirely beyond the pale, right? That was beyond the scope of technical, like day-to-day politics. But it is because the polity was on that issue unified. They were friends as regards that one issue. And so to say it is depoliticized is, from a certain perspective, true. It is beyond the scope of a certain form of, should we say, like lowercase p politics, if I can use that, but still is within the broader concept of who are our friends and who are our enemies. It is simply not within the scope of kind of intramural politics, the kind of squabbling any sort of faction will have. Is it right to distinguish inter and external politics within a group? Is there something there, or am I overextending this?
No, one of the phrases you brought up reminded me of something that's so fundamental in this discussion, which I hadn't mentioned yet. You said the techniques or things like those techniques, we could say. What you have with Schmitt, and this is so definitive of everything, is we end up with remember, Schmitt is a legal scholar. What's going on in the background, and I mean, that's why I have all these notes about this. I wanted to sort of go into all that, but that's like one of my own projects about this discussion, this broader discussion that Schmitt is having with his contemporaries and his immediate predecessors, and who will also become his immediate successors, on what the political even is, and what the political had been understood to be was, you have an authoritative, the most authoritative element of what we're going to call the political. What is right and what is wrong is determined by the science of law, right? In other words, things get adjudicated, right? That's the whole purpose of legal theory and this kind of stuff. And with all of them, there's a kind of turning away from that. This is the whole point of what Weber's getting into, and what Schmitt is pushing back against, and what I mean, sort of run down the list of Durkheim, Tonis, Mannheim, Weber, and then Kojève after him, and Schmitt. They're saying the authority, the sovereign, has been understood in terms of the science of law. But we're turning away from that as the authority, and there's going to be these two alternatives. There's going to be the notion of towards revelation, and that's a whole group of its own sort of new scholars or new thinkers that arise in Germany around this time. And again, they're pushing back against the science of law. They're saying no, because we don't find we don't find them legitimate anymore. This just doesn't seem legitimate. Like it's outdated. And then there's this other group of scholars who are going to say it's not a matter of adjudicating by a science of law. In fact, it is just an absolute moment of decision, of obligation, where you say, this is my side, right? This is where I stand on these. Don't ask me to give it a reason, because remember, it's that's what Weber and all these guys are trying to figure out, is what is the rise of reason or rationality in the history of the West. And in fact, Schmitt is so concerned with this, and to sort of push back against some of these different theories of how it has happened, he actually mocks the word reason or rationality in the concept of the political. He says that's the fashionable word for it, is this, reason, rationality. But really what's going on is he's fundamentally concerned with the question of technology, right? I mean, that's going to be what we refer to as this notion of rationality or something. It's like, what does it mean for something to be technological? And that's why that essay, the concept of the political, is also attached by the editors, the translators, to that other essay of the notion of technology. Because Schmitt flatly says in that essay, he says, everyone believes that this thing we call technology is completely neutral. He said, that's a problem because there's no neutrality in these realms of the political, right? I mean, it's not that there's no neutrality, it's that that's the problem, is that everyone is trying to make these things neutral. They're trying to depoliticize them. And Schmitt is saying,
and I think that more so even than his connection to a certain mid-century German political party, that is predominantly what, and liberal is a messy term, but liberals find so uncomfortable in Schmitt, the rejection of neutrality. Because when we look at the norms of democracy, it is a series of pretenses towards neutrality. An idea of, neutral, fair treatment. And when I reject this, I'm not rejecting a concept of fairness, but it is fundamentally in modern context, we would say a cope, a kind of false coat of paint put on something, a post hoc rationalization. So if we look at, our institutions, these supposedly neutral institutions of law enforcement, for example, well, you don't have to be much of a scholar to discover very quickly that these are not neutral. Even then, it is sort of a desire to reject the concept of a state religion, right? A series of unprovable assertions about the world upon which a polity is based. It is a desire to say, no, we are not like that. We are scientific. We are based in objective reason. And you see this in all of the kind of great modernist regimes, right? You have socialist Soviet science, right? The idea that this project is in some way scientific and neutral in the same way that physics is. And again, put quotes around everything I said. It's an interesting project. And I think why people are so uneasy with Schmitt, because that pretense, that assumption, and assumption that it's a positive or achievable goal of neutrality is being challenged. And that strikes very close at the root of whatever that ideology is. But sorry, Athenian, I interrupted you yet again.
No, look, you said a few key words there that are important to drive home to your listeners. This notion of neutrality or neutralization or depoliticization, and Schmitt hones in on especially technology as being that. What do we know that as? Well, you used it, the word objectivity. Nietzsche famously says, through his Zarathustra, and thus spoke Zarathustra, he said it's called the newest idol, right? The newest idol. And he says it's the state. And he says the state is the coldest of all cold monsters. Well, what do we have to say about science? We say science is cold, right? It's, in other words, there's no warmth of emotion involved because it is objective. In other words, we have turned things into objects in which we have a distance between us and it, wherein our emotions are utterly unattached. That's what this notion of modern science is. Weber is going to famously write the essay on objectivity. See, that's what's going on, and Schmitt is completely aware of this, and he's aware of these various problems. It's coming back around to this notion of defining what is this word society that we use, and what distinguishes it from like civil society, right? Because the understanding is that the communities, the inner communities of like family, friends, and things like that, these were you had, and Schmitt actually discusses this in the concept of political. These are the realms where you have little elbow rooms of freedom, right? That's liberalism. So what is it about liberalism that's so crucial? Liberalism is, let's be very clear about what it is. It is just radical toleration, and to see how much tolerance we can have. In other words, how much of that elbow room we can expand, because on the outskirts of that elbow room of our personal freedom, our communities or society right there, is going to be civil society, right? That's where the law steps in and says, well, you have these certain obligations to fulfill by law. And now that's going to be the notion of nomos, right? The question of what is law. And Schmitt always has that in mind. That's why he's always going to have that in mind of what constitutes modern law, modern nomos. That's why he's going to even write the book, and I think it's one of the last books he writes, The Nomos of the Earth. He's looking at the whole history of the earth and saying there's a nomos, a law, that is more encompassing or that is more new or more modern, as opposed to what we've had in the past that we should be searching for. And so the question is always going to be with regard to a nomos by nature, right? A nomos by physis, right? That's when the question, in other words, of natural law. What was it in pre-modernity versus what is it in modernity? Well, we know what it is in modernity is Hobbes. And so the question is how to move forward with these kinds of things. But what Schmitt has recognized, and by the way, these people who are uncomfortable about Schmitt saying it, they're effectively illiterate because all of the great thinkers were questioning the same thing. They were all trying to understand it. I mean, the opening sentence, for God's sake, of Tonus, right? I mean, he's the one who famously writes the essay, Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft being the community, the close community in which you have freedom, liberalism, freedom of conscience, versus civil society, Gesellschaft. That's what all of them are concerned with, all of them. And the opening sentence, the opening sentence of Tonus's essay, is he says these things are radically in conflict. This is like 1877. Well, that's new under the sun because there's a long tradition in which everyone said no. They flow seamlessly. We call that the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was claiming that through our science, our technology, our science of law, it turns out that there's a perfectly smooth transition from Gemeinschaft, in other words, your freedom of conscience, this toleration, as it spreads into civil society. Hegel is the one who actually says it grows organically out of that. That's Hegel in like 18. Let's see. Philosophy of Right is, I think 1817 or something like that. I mean, but it all comes back around in Hegel to the notion of the master and slave dialectic. And this is really the outgrowth, the long tradition of what's going on with the modern friend-enemy distinction, is this notion of consciousness coming to know itself, right? In other words,
and there's an interesting element where it's almost as if in that paradigm, science functions as revelation, knowledge sort of injected from outside of the bounds of human consciousness, from somewhere else. And it's sort of an interesting conception of science as both truly neutral and objective and of something outside of man. And you see this and this is a sort of stupid example, but we'll go with it, in the way capital S science is spoken about. You meet these people who consider themselves, data-based, or they're in love with the data, as the T-shirt goes. And again, yeah, I'm sure you've met one or two of these people.
The stats, the data.
It is effectively this idea of this sort of external rule book, which dictates exactly how humans should operate. And again, nothing is neutral. And I think that in a way, not even in a way, they have sort of substituted a supernatural revelation with a scientific one. The idea of, and sort of butchering Schmitt again, but this kind of like political miracle almost, something that sort of, and I realize he meant that in a different sense, but sort of like existing outside of the normal natural order. Sorry, Athenian, I'm just rambling at this point, but
no, look,
I feel like there's something there.
No, we both ramble. That's what makes these conversations great.
That's what they call a podcast, is an hour-long ramble.
Oh man, we already hit an hour? Crap.
No, not at all. We're only halfway done. We got plenty of time.
Yeah, okay, good. Because no, I was gonna say this, and see, here's the pink elephant in the room that not only does nobody address, but they don't see it, they don't realize it. Our word science comes from the Greek word episteme. Now, think about that in Aristotle, because remember, in the background is Aristotle on the concept of the friend. He never really discusses the enemy. And he's also said man is by nature political, right? The natural state of man, in other words, is political, right? And what's the problem with liberalism that Schmitt is addressing? They're claiming that the natural state of man is not political. It should be depoliticized. It's neutral. Why? Well, because we have this new thing called modern science. Well, what was pre-modern science? In Aristotle, in the same book, the Nicomachean Ethics, where he talks about, where he says man's by nature political, rational, and he gives two entire chapters on friendship. He makes this the strongest claim he ever says in the entirety of the Nicomachean Ethics is he said, there's no man alive who would want even all the goods if he couldn't have friends. I mean, that's the strongest claim he makes. He says, this is chapter 6, it turns out that episteme, science, is in fact a virtue of man. He calls it an intellectual virtue. So what happens for science in the pre-modern sense, and all of a sudden it's a virtue, it's something you strive toward, it is part of, it is literally what a human excellence. Science is a human excellence. Then all of a sudden we get to modernity. What happens? Science becomes method. This is Descartes, discourse on method. In other words, objective, right? You treat things as objects. You have distance between you and it. That's going to be what science is. And so the notion of science or episteme, knowledge, as an intellectual virtue is sort of, it's hollowed out entirely and replaced with this new thing known as method, which of itself is defined by objectivity and which tells us what neutrality is, right? In other words, how to get neutrality. And that defines what we would otherwise think of as technology. And all of a sudden, see that, then you've got then the Enlightenment is off and running. And then it all falls apart. It's all beginning to fall apart in the late 1870s. And that's when all these great thinkers, either French or German, even over in England too, are saying, we might have been wrong. And that's the tradition that Schmitt is writing in here, just in, I mean, as early as 1919, the same time that Weber gives his famous essay on politics as a vocation. In other words, a vocation of the political, right? Where he tells us what the political is in that essay. That same year is when Carl Schmitt publishes his book, Political Romanticism. And the preface alone is worth reading. It's incredibly important because Schmitt even says, political romanticism is a kind of longing, and trying to overcome that longing, whether you're wanting to make a return movement or something to back to something better, he says that too is a longing. And so it too is political romanticism, right? So what do we do? What do we do? And that's what Schmitt is answering here with this friend-enemy distinction, which he's going to just, I mean, it's always there. I mean, it's definitive of his political thought. And it has everything, like you said, it has everything to do with these conceptions. Because remember what I told you earlier is that they're turning away from science. That's what's going on in the late modernity. They're turning away from the Enlightenment project. They're realizing it has fundamental problems, and they're saying that you're splitting it off into two branches. You're having people who are going to, on the one hand, say, let's turn towards a much more robust understanding of divine revelation, and then you're having others saying, no, we don't need. What we need is a notion of a thorough understanding of sovereignty that is not technic, right? It's not a science of law. It's just radical obligation, the kind of absolute moment, the urgency of the moment to make it to choose your sides. And that's going to be Schmitt. Now, what he's going to do, though, is he's going to find Christianity in that because he doesn't take seriously claims that Hobbes was not a sincere Christian. That's going to be a problem. That's going to be a serious problem, but it's still something to consider. That's why I worry sometimes about a lot of Christians who want to sort of adopt Schmitt. They don't see that there's a problem there because if Hobbes is in fact not a sincere Christian, then Schmitt's turn back to Hobbes could be very problematic. And that's when you have to reassess, should we in fact go back and entertain what Hobbes got wrong about, for instance, Aristotle. That's when you have Leo Strauss steps onto the stage. So Strauss and Schmitt are very good friends, so good friends that when Strauss fled Germany. Schmitt was the one who got him a job when he was basically homeless and unemployed. Couldn't feed his wife. Couldn't take care of himself. Schmitt got him a job, and that's why in the English translation of the concept of the political, it's none other than Strauss who writes this amazing book review of the concept of the political, because at the same time that Schmitt is deeply involved in his own explorations into Hobbes, Leo Strauss, when he flees Germany, he's buried in the British library, Oxford Library and such, doing his own research on a book that he's about to publish called the Political Theory of Thomas Hobbes, or the Political Philosophy of Hobbes. And it's none other than Schmitt who says, of all my readers, Leo Strauss saw through me like an X-ray machine. And that's what I wish people would take more seriously who want to read Schmitt is, well, read what, I mean, the editors of the English translation of the concept of the political, they've included Strauss's essay where he provides a kind of critique and possible flaws, while also saying that Schmitt is a first-rate thinker. He's a first-rate sort of political theorist and stuff. I mean, he separates. At one point, Strauss says the fact that that Schmitt does not fall in line by saying that these various concepts of cultures, these separate entities of aesthetics and such, that he realizes that they might need to be replaced entirely. That alone sets him apart from everyone else who's talking about this notion of the political and stuff. And so, I mean, he sees him as a top-rate thinker. So, I mean, it's worth people to read that. I mean, that's why the editors included the book review in the collection. So,
there are several things there. I think that going back to this concept of I guess we could say like method, objectivity. There are several things, and we see this currently in a lot of the discussion around effectively, what is a nation, right? Is a nation simply a propositional set of objective standards and statements anyone can assent to, be a part of, and then profit from that system?
Exactly.
And some would say, well, simply, America is, it is an idea, and whoever best meets these set of objective criteria, you can imagine, ought to be brought here as an American. And you can look at that and say, clearly that is not an ideologically neutral reading. Clearly politics has entered into that. And I think even deeper buried is both this concept of science as exterior to man and revelation, but also as reason as sort of the preeminent and best part of man. And when we look at Augustine, he has this idea of every part of man being corrupted by sin, including his reason. His capacity for reason is not unchained from his desires. And that sort of dim view of human nature is something you see, I mean, even in figures like, I almost called Thomas Sowell Clarence Thomas, which is deeply racist, and I apologize. But even in his conception of, I think he calls it like the limited frame, or the tragic vision, the idea that ultimately every part of man is broken and flawed, and our job is to mitigate that to the best of our idea. But even I think that concept of logic and reason is ultimately being flawed and subordinate to man's, if we want to adopt kind of a theological framework, sin nature is vital to countering that kind of, I don't want to say overly scientific, that sounds too positive, but the sort of framework we're talking about there. Athenian, do you see what I'm getting at there? I'm struggling for words.
Yeah, Schmitt addresses this explicitly. He says, what happens when you drop the notion of original sin? Right? I mean, if you drop the notion of original sin, you're going to have problems with your notions of the political, because it's this element of original sin it's not amenable to these notions of modern science. Now, what's going on? Because remember, we're talking about this notion of the political and the problem of making it scientific. What's going on is this phenomena of the rise of sociology. In other words, the science of societies. And again, this is something that Schmitt is, I mean, he's absolutely engaged in the dialogue with these people about this. Uh, I mean, and so Durkheim, right, he's famously writing these. He's understood to be as the sort of the founder of sociology, the father of modern sociology, and we're talking 1880s. And he writes the opening letter, the opening of the lectures that he gives in France to define what sociology is. I mean, because remember, we're trying to understand what the political is, but we're using these terms like society and civil society, Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft. And this is what he says. This is the opening line. He says, since Plato and his Republic, there's been no lack of thinkers who have philosophized about the nature of societies. So they're saying, look, we need to understand what the nature of societies is. Well, how do you find out what the nature of something is? Well, you try to attach a logos to it, which in other words, try to attach a science. But in modernity, it means a method, right? And so that's sort of what's going on here. And what ends up happening, and this is the critique that Strauss gives of Schmitt in. I mean, it's a tip of the hat, and it's also a critique in the concept of the political with the friend-enemy distinction, because Strauss is saying, is he right about saying that the friend-enemy distinction is the fundamental defining feature? And he's saying, well, he's yes and no. But what he's saying is that Schmitt recognizes this notion of culture, right? Culture is something new under the sun. Schmitt is deeply aware of this. This is the whole purpose of his discussion, and he addresses it in uh, the Political Romanticism, which is his first book, effectively, 1919, right? And he's addressing these various romantic thinkers, uh, beginning sort of with Rousseau and et cetera. And one of them, following Rousseau, is going to give us this word. And this, by the way, comes from, on the one hand, Puffendorf, we're not really sure, or Herder. But they're aware of this. And Puffendorf is deeply sort of the founder of modern legal theory, right? So again, you see why Schmitt would know these things and why he addresses them. He's going to tell us what culture is. This is where we're going to get the notion of a Volk, right, a people, and also a Zeitgeist. We get these words from Herder. Schmitt is aware of this. And what's at issue is what existed prior to the notion of culture, of the people as a culture. You can't just critique the word culture and say it's new and say, okay, it's new. And people sort of shake their head like, that's so ingrained in our language. We don't know what words were used before that. Well, it was citizenship. And that's what defined a people. This is what Aristotle tells us is the definitive of the city is that to have citizens. But what's also definitive too is the household. And it's the question of how do you get the household and the notion of citizenship together, right? That's going to be the purpose of education. But when you talk about these people who talk about the founding of like America or something like that, they say, well, it's an idea. Well, no, that's to say that citizenship was an idea because that's what we understood America to be. We defined it in terms of citizenship, which is to say that was something you strived for to achieve in your life, and that you handed off to your children, and that you as a society, right, as a people, were able to accomplish. And so when we got rid of citizenship, which we did a long time ago, then of course you're going to have people just farting out this nonsense today, like, well, look, America is just an idea. No, it's not, you moron. That's some crap that got farted out with the so-called new historians, going back to like the 1950s and 60s at least. I mean, it's just a bunch of nonsense, but most of them are Marxists anyway. But that's going to be the issue. There is this notion of culture versus citizenship. But again, even that too, though, is going to be problematic because, well, it's not so much problematic, but I mean, that's definitive of the Leviathan for Hobbes. That is what the Leviathan is. This brings in, by the way, that's why he titles it the Leviathan. It's from the book of Job. I mean, look at Schmitt's full title for his book on Hobbes. It's political symbolism and its failure, right? The Leviathan is from the book of Job. And when you look at the frontispiece for Hobbes's Leviathan, it's this great beast that gets described in the book of Job, but all of its little scales are the people, right? And at the very head of all of them is the sovereign. And that's crucial. The scales that constitute the Leviathan are all the people. And what Schmitt is understanding there is he's saying, look, they had an absolute, it was a decisionary moment, right, to get out of the state of nature and agreed to this social contract in a sense, to all be under the sovereignty, the absolute sovereignty of an enlightened despot. And that's what makes kind of a people. That's what we could have again if we understand the significance of political symbolism and how political symbols go about failing. Because most people don't. Most people talk about Hobbes and Leviathan all day, but they'll never say anything at all about the whole point of why it's titled the Leviathan, right? And what's the significance of Leviathan for the Bible for Hobbes, especially because he spends the first part and the last part of the entire Leviathan, hundreds of pages, criticizing the Bible. So you sort of got to understand these things. And Schmitt, he's right there on top of it. He sees it all. I mean, he fully understands that. So now we see how complicated these things become, right? I mean, it's like, okay, our country is just ideas. In other words, are they human rights, right? This nonsense of human rights, just ideas, or is it should it be a kind of return to a notion of citizenship, or is it going to be this liberalism of cultures, various spheres of culture, right? What are our options? And what Schmitt does when he's surveying all this is he says, look, I can tell you what the issue is. That you people don't understand how to determine who your enemies are, right? Because remember, the enemy is more important than understanding the friend, because without recognizing who your enemies are, you're not going to know who your friends are for him. So again, it's sort of, it unfolds into everything, but you always have to keep your eye on the fact that it's in itself, it all unfolds from this notion of the enemy, distinguishing between enemies and inimicos, and the valence of that.
So there's something I want to get into there. If we can say that there is a failure in overprivileging reason, I think there is a similar related failure, and we see this in the kind of new historical conception of citizenship, which is an overfocus on, to use the language of 2010s campus politics, continuous affirmative consent. And it's almost, and this is the way that Evola and others would call it, like the merchant powers, the rule by the merchants, phrase everything in the language of contract. So you have both the assent. What is need is, a deal offered and then accepted by, a person in full capacity of reason. And also that every one of these terms is equally agreed upon and assented to. That the only legitimacy is the legitimacy of the contract. There is no ownership and obligation that is deeper, older, or unchosen. The ownership that your fatherland has over you is not legitimate. It is your assent to a series of propositional values. And I think that if we can consider both the overprivilege of reason and then also that of consent, I think that describes a certain type of error that is linked, I guess, one to another.
Yeah, just 2 points here. Schmitt's little book, Political Theology. Let's take a look at the opening line. All significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. In other words, it's theology that's been gutted. It's been infected by liberalism. Whatever secularization is, we have to make sure we understand the difference between secularization and anti-biblical, right? That's going to be the key point in determining whether or not Hobbes is a sincere Christian. But they're secularized theological concepts, not only because of their historical development, so he's got the rise of liberalism in mind, he says, but also because of their systematic structure, the recognition of which, in other words, the recognition of the systematic structure of the secularization of these concepts, he says the recognition of that is necessary for a sociological consideration of these concepts. So again, we see why it is that the notion of distinguishing Gemeinschaft, Gesellschaft, the rise of sociology, science is important. So the theology is involved there, how it came to be not even dependent upon the divine anymore. And then what you mentioned there about Evola and how it is that you have the understanding of, in other words, just merchant thinking. Well, I can take you exactly to where it begins. Effectively, this is Hobbes, and this is what Schmitt is fully aware of. Chapter 5, Part 1 of the Leviathan, of reason and science. Hobbes says, when a man reasons, he does nothing else but conceive a sum total from additional parcels, or conceive a remainder from subtracting. So in other words, reason is just this adding and subtracting of various things. In other words, reason is just mere calculation. It's just calculation. You're calculating, and not any calculation. It's calculation in terms of goods, merchant thinking.
It's like an abacus, basically.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, and he goes on to give it just incredibly more detail. But also keep in mind, Hobbes has just finished telling us in the previous chapters that words are just words, right? They don't really correspond to anything. Hobbes is a nominalist. Locke is going to be like this too, but they both recognize that reason, modern reason, remember what we were talking about before, modern logos, modern law, right? Modern rationality. What's so definitive about it is that it's just this sort of calculation. So modern reason, modern rationality is just a calculation of your own goods that you can attain, right? We're literally looking at the rise of liberalism, right? This is,
Well, it's like it's equating that with the kind of rational self-interest we would talk about in economics, the maximizing your utility.
Hobbes is going to flatly say that reason is just another passion. Reason is no different from the passions, right? So everything is self-interest through and through, right? And that's sort of the scandalous thing about this. But again, Schmitt sees all of this, and that's what Schmitt is concerned with, is understanding in terms of these, because he says no one has done it better than Hobbes. Hobbes really understood our world, and sort of what has happened is, as he says in that opening line of Political Theology, everything has gone down the road of secularization. There are these theological concepts, but they've been secularized. And so we need to understand, we need to have a science, as he says, of sociology. We need to understand sociology in other words, knowing the difference between Gemeinschaft and the tension with Gesellschaft, these kinds of things. But that's what he's concerned with. And again, we see this, it is a whole chapter in Hobbes, and it becomes thematic through the whole of Leviathan, is that man is just this self-interested, calculating being. Well, what do we know about modern law, modern natural law? If that's modern reason, modern logos. Remember what we said about modern natural law, modern nomos, is that it's a state of war. There you have it. That's why it's a state of war, is because man is always just calculating, thinking merchantly in terms of his own self-interest. That's why you need the sovereign. That's the Leviathan. That's why you need this enlightened despot, because that is the nature of man. And Schmitt is saying he's right.
It's the enlightened despot can come in and sort of create the set of incentives to align the people, to create a unity through terror is probably a really negative way to phrase it, but effectively say, align everyone's rational self-interest in a way to create like fellow feeling, right? To drive people into one direction.
Right. This is the whole point of the sovereign. The question is, what is law? What is nomos? Nomos is what the sovereign says it is. Period. That's it. In other words, no technological science to sort of justify it. No. Law is just what the sovereign says it is. So if law is just what the sovereign says it is, the sovereign can decide what laws to have on the books that will incentivize people to do things that he would rather see them doing than things he would rather see them not doing. And that's going to be what Schmitt understands as the way in which to get out of the problem of liberalism, which is creating these zones of neutrality.
So, Athenian, unfortunately, we're coming up on time. Do you want to, if you can, I guess, because we've gone well past where I thought we were going to, which is always what happens, but it's a ton of fun. If you
Well,
could, wrap this up, I guess we could. I'll have you back on again because I feel like we haven't gotten even to half of what I wanted to.
see, I feel bad about that because I want to make sure that I always stay focused on the topic you want to. So the notion of
Look,
the
Athenian, I was not helping you stay on topics.
well, here's the thing though, is that the notion of the enemy, the inimicos, that's what the foundation of all of this is. Because remember, what is the nature of man? That's going to be what modern law is. It's the state of nature, right? Man is fundamentally enemies towards his fellow man. There's no such thing as fellow man because man is so self-interested. That's going to be what Schmitt has in mind, primarily with the friend-enemy distinction, is understanding that about man. In other words, privileging the enemy over the friend part because that's going to tell you who your friends are. And so that's why these various, what might seem to be these various tangents that I've gone on to sort of, they might seem like it's like, well, it's interesting, but is it really related to the enemy? Well, yeah, everything. Think of it this way. For Schmitt, the enemy is the hub of a wheel from which all the rest of the spokes come out so that you even have the wheel. You have to know where the enemy is. You have to know how to find the enemy, the inimicos. And that's what he's telling us, is that you have to understand, if you understand human nature the way Hobbes did, then you've understood how to find the enemy. And so that's why there's going back and forth between the notion of modern law, modern reason, right? Self-interestedness, right? Bloody war, that kind of stuff, as well as how it came to be that, according to Schmitt, modern concepts of the political are just secularized concepts from theology. He's going to make sure that that doesn't happen again. How do you make sure that the secularization process doesn't happen? Well, you've got to return to a notion of the sovereignty that we have with something like a Hobbes. In other words, get rid of this idea of objectivity guiding science. Now, when you say that to most people, they're like, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. Like, objectivity, like, what do you mean? You're saying to do away with objectivity? Like, that's how ingrained in our language these words are. Objectivity, culture, science. We don't even realize what these thinkers realize, by the way, Schmitt included, what they realize about these words and where they come from, right? Schmitt is always writing these long historical treatises. He's tracing down these concepts from the history of the great thinkers. So if we want to take seriously Schmitt, then we should take seriously his account of their history. And Schmitt knew this history. Schmitt was raised and deeply educated in biblical studies, in Greek tragedy, right? These kinds of things. This notion of the authority, that's certainly going to arise in Greek tragedy. I mean, that's everything, with Aeschylus, Oedipus, etc. I say Oedipus, but you know, I get them mixed up. It's not Euripides, Sophocles. Yeah.
Well, Athenian, thank you so much. This was fascinating, genuinely. You, like me, do this full time, so people should obviously support you. They want to. What's the new way they can do that?
Well, I'm transferring everything over to Substack, so I encourage anyone who's aware of like my website or Spotify. Well, I'm not even really on Spotify. It's more or less Buzzsprout or whatever. Just find me on Substack at Athens Stranger, or it's Athens Corner. But you can find me there. I've got all my stuff. I'm uploading more and more and a lot newer stuff than I had previously done because I'm such a perfectionist. I got to go back and do it all over again because I end up sometimes kind of rambling like this conversation. it's like I re-listen to it. I'm like, I could have done that better if I stayed a little more on topic and saved the tangential stuff for like at the very end as a kind of, sort of wow them or something like that.
Well, dude, I'm genuinely so glad to see you on the platform. You're doing great. Everyone check out Athenian Stranger. Look, we oftentimes compare this quarter of the internet to some sort of like jerry-rigged university. Athenian Stranger actually belongs in a university. He's too good for us. So support him. He does very good work. Can't recommend it enough. As far as my stuff, Jay Burden Show, available anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. You want to support me? You can either do that directly by heading over to Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad. Throw me a few bucks, get the episodes early and ad-free. Or check out our sponsor, Axios Remote Fitness Coaching. If you want to look like Athenian, you want to get jacked, JD can help you do it. Again, man, I appreciate it. And everyone at home, keep your head up. Life can't last forever. Good night.